Hello, I'm Randy Seaver. We're continuing our series titled, Did John Piper Recant Calvinism? Leighton Flowers versus Romans chapter 5. And I've titled it that way because Mr. Flowers has stated that if God had imputed Adam's sin, at least he implied that if God had imputed Adam's sin to us, and we were not found guilty simply because of our own personal transgression, God would not be fair. He stated it's just intuitive. We just know because it just seems right that God must not have imputed Adam's sin because God's fair, God's just, and if God's just, He wouldn't do that. And we've already answered that to some extent in the first video. You want to see it? Go back and look at it again. Question is then, what does Romans chapter 5 really teach? What's Paul saying? And is what Paul is saying primarily about the imputation of Adam's sin, or is what Paul's saying primarily about something else that depends on our understanding of the imputation of Adam's sin? This is what the Westminster Shorter Catechism says about the effects of sin on the race. The sinfulness of that estate whereinto man fell consists in the guilt of Adam's sin, the guilt of Adam's first sin, the want of original righteousness, the corruption of his whole nature, which is commonly called original sin, together with all actual transgression proceeding from it. So in other words, we are guilty because of what Adam did, and we are also guilty because of what we have done. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, because Paul in verse 20 says, as if things weren't bad enough, sin, the law entered, so that the trespass might abound. In other words, things got worse when the law entered, because not only did we have the one transgression, now we have our own. And Jesus comes and He deals with both of those. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But Paul says very clearly in chapter 5, verse 12, wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world. Sin would not have been in the human family apart from the fact that Adam transgressed a clearly defined law of God. God said, in the day that you eat of the fruit of that tree, you shall surely die. And that death is passed from Adam to all his posterity. And so Paul says, therefore, as through one man's sin entered the world, and death by sin, in other words, death would not exist had sin not existed, so death passed through the race, passed upon all men, or through to all men, because all sinned in Adam. Now, he's going to demonstrate that in the parenthesis, because in verse 13, he's going to say, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin isn't imputed where there is no law. Sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. And he shows us that the reason sin is not imputed where there is no law is because where there is no law, sin does not have the character of transgression. There's a difference between inadvertently wandering onto a piece of property, private property, that is not ours, and deliberately, willfully overstepping a clearly defined boundary that says, thou shalt not trespass. Those two things are different. One misses the mark, the other is an act of deliberate, high-handed rebellion. And what Paul is saying is, those between Adam and Moses, between the clear-cut command God gave to Adam, don't eat of the tree, when you do, you're going to die, that was a clear commandment. Adam did not merely miss the mark, Adam rebelled. People between Adam and Moses did not sin in the same way that Adam sinned, that is, by disobeying a clearly defined boundary. Was there law in the world prior to that? Yes. Natural law. People knew intuitively. People knew innately that there were certain things that were right and certain things that were wrong. That's what Romans chapter 2 teaches us. And therefore they made laws for themselves. Okay? They became a law to themselves. And they established certain boundaries because of the image of God that was stamped on them. But they didn't overstep a clearly defined boundary. And so Paul says, nevertheless, death reigned. Why did death reign if they had not sinned as Adam sinned, and their transgressions were not put to their account? In other words, what Paul is saying in this verse is people did not die between Adam and Moses because of their own personal sins, because their sins did not have the character of transgression. Paul writes back in Romans chapter 4, where there is no law, there is no transgression. He doesn't mean where there is no law, there is no sin. Yes, sin existed. But apart from law, there is not transgression. It is transgression that is the problem. And yet Paul says people didn't die because of their own personal sins between Adam and Moses, because there was no law for them to transgress, and yet they still died. Some have taken this as a reference to infants. Why do infants die? Do infants die because they sinned in the womb? Do infants die because they personally transgressed the law of God? No, of course not. But apart from sin, apart from transgression, there is no death. So if there is death, there must be some sort of transgression. What is it? Is it personal transgression? Paul answers no, it isn't personal transgression. The reason all die is because all sinned in Adam. That's Paul's argument. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. There was no law for them to transgress, but they still died. Why did they die? Not for their personal transgression. They died because Adam's transgression had been imputed to them. Now, he says this at the end of verse 14. They had not sinned in the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type, a foreshadowing, a corresponding figure to him who was to come. Who's that? Well, that's talking about Christ. Christ is referred to as the last Adam in the New Testament. Adam, the first man, is like in some way the last man. Now, we know in typology that, as in parables, everything is not corresponding. If you try to press parables to the ultimate, you're always going to run into trouble, because parables aren't intended to teach more than one primary lesson. They may incidentally teach other lessons, but they're primarily intended to teach one lesson. Same thing's true of types. Types aren't intended to correspond in every single aspect. There are likely more ways in which Adam is unlike Christ than there are ways in which Adam is like Christ. In fact, generally speaking, as we look at types and fulfillment, or type and antitype, the antitype is always better than the type. There is a heightening between the type and the antitype. So what Christ did is going to be different from what Adam did in certain senses. And these would be the senses. And Paul gives us really another parenthesis beginning in verse 15, within a parenthesis running down to the end of verse 17. Here's what Paul is saying to us. In verse 15, he is saying, and notice the words in that verse, much more, but the free gift is not like the offense. For if by one man's offense many died, much more. There's much more. That is, Christ confers more to his people than Adam lost for his people. Much more. The gift of grace of the one man abounded to the many. Notice the overflowing nature of the grace of God, abounded to many. Verse 16, what is that teaching us? He talks about the one offense and the many offenses. The one offense is Adam's, the many offenses are our offenses. Not only did Christ die for the one offense of Adam, he died for that offense as well as the many offenses which we committed after that. And so his work is superior to Adam's work. He more than undid what Adam did. He does not merely pardon the offense, but he grants a positive righteousness to his people. And then in verse 17, we see those words much more again. For if by one man's offense death reigned through one, much more. In other words, not only does he undo what Adam did, but he causes us, because of our union with Christ, to reign as kings and priests, because we are in him who is the king, who has triumphed. And so there are these ways in which Adam and Christ are not alike. Another way in which Adam and Christ are not alike is Adam brought condemnation. Jesus brings justification. And so there's this disparity between these two. In what ways then, in what way are Adam and Christ type and antitype? In what way is there an essential theological correspondence, a typical correspondence between Adam and Christ? And the answer to the question is because both of them are real men who have been divinely appointed as representative heads of their respective peoples. Let me say that to you again. Adam and Christ are alike in that both of them are real men who have been divinely appointed as representative heads of their distinctive peoples. Adam represents all who are in him. Christ represents all who are in him. And this is the heart of Paul's argument in this passage. If we argue, listen to this carefully, if we argue that Adam's transgression is not imputed to us, but only his nature is imputed to us, and we are guilty because of the outworking of that nature in our personal sin, then the corresponding idea is that Christ's nature is imputed to us, infused grace, if you will, and we are justified not by his imputed righteousness, but by our personal acts of righteousness that flow from that nature. That is heresy. You see, you can't deny one truth without denying the other truth. And Paul's whole argument in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 19, is that just as by the one man's sin we have become guilty and therefore die, and death passes through the whole race, indicating the universality of sin, even so, justification comes to us not because of our personal righteousness, not because of our faithfulness, not because of our obedience, but by the obedience of Christ imputed to us. And his argument is just as Adam's transgression guaranteed the condemnation of all who are in him and continue in him, so Christ's one act of righteousness guarantees the justification and glorification of all who are in him. Now that is the good news of the gospel, and that is the good news that is destroyed if we deny the imputation of Adam's sin. I hope you'll understand that. Perhaps I'll come back with another video and try to reinforce that so that I'll make sure you understand. Make sure you get it, because that's the heart of the gospel. Until next time, may God richly bless you.